as Professor John Potter, that is a senior lecturer in education and new media at the London Knowledge Lab in the Department of Culture, Communication and Media at the Institute of Education, University of London. He is currently the departmental postgraduate research tutor and was formerly the program leader for the MA Media, Culture and Education. Prior to joining the University of London, he worked extensively in ICT, in education, in teacher education, primary and secondary, at Goldsmith College Department of Educational Studies and at the University of East London. Before working in higher education, he was an ICT advisor in the London Borough of Newham and a primary school teacher with management responsibility for ICT, literacy and assessment in Tower Hamlets. His research and publications are in fields of digital video production by young learners, the focus of his doctoral research, cultural practice and new literacies, memory, self-representation and curatorship. The use of social software and online networks for publication and learning, media education, new literacies, creative activity and learning agency, the changing nature of teaching and learning in response to the pervasive use in wider culture of media technologies in formal and informal settings. He has presented his work widely at national and international conferences. His most recent publication in the field, which has been very well reviewed in UK and US, advanced the theory of curation as a meta-level authorship and new literacy practice. It was published by Palgrave in New York at the end of 2012. Digital Media and Learner Identity, the new curatorship. So, after this more formal presentation of Professor John Potter, I think we will have here a very interesting presentation. He is a person, a researcher, that comes from a variety and has a variety, is very polyphastate, so I think we all are anxious to listen to his words. Please, Professor John.
Thank you. Should have cleared my throat before speaking. Good morning, bon dia. And first I have to apologize for being English and therefore monolingual. And thank you for tolerating me speaking in English. It's kind of embarrassing when everyone I meet, everywhere I go, speaks 3 or 4 languages beautifully, so apologies for that. I've been fortunate to have some translation of some of the slides by a student of mine who I share with the University of Lisbon, Tania Fonseca. So she's provided the title slide at least, and 1 or 2 others during the presentation in Portuguese. Yeah, as Maria says, my background is really in primary school teaching. I was a primary school teacher for about 10 years, and then after that working much more with adults in advisory work and then in teacher education in primary schools, mostly in East London and in South East London, which I would consider to be the most interesting parts of London. And I can say that if David Buckingham were here, he'd be saying North London is the best, and I'd say no, I don't agree with that. So we have many arguments about this. South East London is the most interesting place. Okay, so I want to talk to you about a couple of different projects that I've been involved with over the years and set the agenda by saying immediately that my main interest in this line, whatever this line of work is in people first and technology second. And that I believe that technology doesn't determine anything, but human actors and human agents determine what happens. And that technology is in the mix. But I'm not a technological evangelist, because too many times things have gone wrong for me down the years with technology. And I'm not a technological determinist in any way. I've been very fortunate to work with some very interesting people. I should put my affiliation slide back up at the bottom there. I work at the Institute of Education. You can see the logo bottom left, which is a federal college of the University of London and one of the leading research centres for education, I guess, in the world, really. So very lucky to work there, and a privilege to work with supervisors of the calibre of Professor David Buckingham and Professor Andrew Byrne, who remains a close colleague of mine. I work in something called the London Knowledge Lab, which is a research centre within the Institute of Education, and it hosts some very interesting projects in itself. There's a very big centre organised by Professor Carey Jewett and as co-directed with Professor Günter Kress. So again, very lucky to have people around me and people in that setting who work with multimodality. And on the extreme right, this thing that says DARE stands for Digital Arts Research in Education, and it's a collaborative for having more interesting conversations about digital technology in the context of the arts and making. And so we work with the Tate Gallery and with the British Film Institute and the ICA in London, so we're very connected to the art scene, arts and culture scene in London, and that's another interesting context for me. But I want to talk about some research that I did as part of my doctoral study between 2003 and 2009, and another project in primary schools, which led to the publication of this book with Neil Selwyn and Sue Cranmer, called Primary Schools and ICT, Learning from Pupil Perspectives. And this was very much about talking to children about their uses of technology and media outside of school, and it was researching an under-researched group of students aged between 7 and 11. Many projects are concerned with youth, young people who are older than that, and this was about the upper end of primary school in the UK, between ages of 7 and 11. I want to talk about a couple of ways of thinking about the uses of technology in constructing identity and how that might impact on teaching and learning, on pedagogy, which led to the publication of this book, which is Digital Media and Learner Identity, that Maria mentioned earlier. And I also want to touch on some changes to the curriculum in England which are impacting on the uses of computers in school, where we have a new curriculum which is displaced ICT. ICT does not exist as a curriculum subject from September 2014 and has been replaced by something called computing, and what the implications of that are. If I get time, I also have a manifesto for media education. It's really quite difficult to use the word media in the UK at the moment, but I kind of like that word, so I will use the word media frequently, even if it has been erased from history in our curriculum. So we'll see. Okay, so to begin with, I just want to say a little bit about a philosophy of research anyway. I think, how many people here are doing a PhD, just as a matter of interest? Great. And then it's the happiest time of your life. Because, you know, in conversation with your supervisor who is gently encouraging you along the way, you are having those kinds of conversations where you are constructing the frame. So this is a rather clumsy visual attempt to say, hey, there's a frame around a picture. And inside there are some children, photographs of some children. You have the opportunity to construct the frame yourself, and to an extent, you have the opportunity to dictate the research agenda. What are the twists and turns that you make? You have a degree of agency in that research, which is quite empowering and which you probably won't ever have again. So enjoy the moment, even the bad moments. Because what happens afterwards, of course, is that things get a little bit more diffuse, And if you're looking for research funding, it's sometimes difficult to lose the thread or the context that you wish to explore when you are working to someone else's agenda. And sometimes you have to negotiate that. So this is another clumsy visual attempt to say things get a little bit faded out from what your primary interest is when you undertake funded research. So I've been lucky to do some funded research. I'd like to do more. And the kinds of amounts of money and the kinds of projects I've been involved with have actually involved a certain degree of agency. I've been very lucky in that respect. And I've worked researching animation in primary school classrooms, researching pupil perspective, researching the connection between literacy activities for children aged 6, 7, 8, and how the teaching of poetry to children of that age can be enhanced by the use of animation, which seems to me an extraordinary thing to have got money to explore, but a fabulous, very interesting project. And along the way, I think in this and many other things, I've collected a lot of data that has never really been analyzed, that has gone into the file folders. The report has been handed over, and maybe I've written some papers from it, but sometimes it's really interesting to go back to the work that you've done and to listen again to some of the things that you might have missed, that are actually still telling you things, and to try to weave that back into a narrative. So recently, when I've spoken about the kind of research that I do, I've persuaded myself to look back at some of this data and to see, is there anything of interest there? So this is a listen to the quiet voice type activity. That's a quotation from Brian Eno from his Oblique Strategies. He made a set of cards in the 1970s with an artist called Peter Schmidt. When you're blocked in a certain activity, you choose a card and you follow the advice on the card. One of them says, listen to the quiet voice. And so that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to play it for a little bit. It's quite difficult to hear if you are a native English speaker, actually, as well. But there's a story being told here. The researcher asks some really stupid questions, that's me, so I will cringe when they come up, probably even hide under the table at certain points. But the child tells a different story than the agenda that the researcher has. The researcher is there to find out what kinds of informal filmmaking practices do you do outside of school and on what devices. But actually, so much more is revealed about the life of the child. And Tanya has translated some of what goes on there into Portuguese. But I will play a little bit and we'll see how we go.
You mentioned that you've got something on your phone that can do animation. I mean, do you ever make films outside of school yourself?
Yeah.
Sorry, just to say at the beginning, here the boy is talking about filmmaking on a phone.
Sometimes.
Really? And do you make them up just straight out of your head and you shoot them? In... Brilliant.
Well,
what do you use to do them?
My mum's got a video camera on her phone.
Oh, right.
And what we do, I ask Mum if I can use the video camera because she hasn't got any credits, so she can't find anyone. And I let her borrow my phone.
Right.
And what we do, I go outside with some friends, and because my back garden, we have loads and loads of junk and all that, like torn wires and all that. Yeah. So what we do, we know the most thing we know is normally do. We play a second Sathora, you know, Jumanji, by the space.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
We normally play Sathora, but different. No one gets frozen. Well, someone does get frozen because you shove them in the freezer.
You make your own version of them.
Okay. The boy is talking in this kind of breathless, excited way about this world outside of school. And there's some concern in the mind of the researcher during this narrative. The boy is describing how they always put a friend of theirs in the deep freeze in the back garden, in a broken deep freeze with all wires around it. So there's a moral, ethical dilemma about raising the alarm with the class teacher about this activity. It turns out that it always has to be the same boy that goes in the deep freeze, so it's not a great situation, but it's so that reveals something of the world of the child. But interestingly, it reveals a lot about the imperative and the motivation to try and engage with media culture in spite of quite low socio-economic conditions that this child lives in. If you were able to understand the first part of it, there's a kind of bartering arrangement which goes on. When his mother runs out of pay-as-you-go mobile credit, she has a very nice phone with a camera, and she gives it to her son. He makes films on it, and she gets to use his pay-as-you-go credit instead. So it tells you something about the world of the child. It tells you also something about the life of technology. And sometimes over the years, and I've been in this, researching this for a long time now, I guess, we get a little bit fixated about the devices and not enough fixated about their lived experience with the devices and what it actually means to own one, what it actually means to use it. And for those of us that work in teaching and learning, how aware are we of the life of the device and the life of the child around the device? How aware are we of that? Do we make suppositions about these things? Do we presume that because somebody lives in a poor district of London that they have no access whatsoever? Do we assume that a child who lives in a very wealthy part of London has great access to media and technology and so forth? It's very, very complicated. It's complicated because technology doesn't lead it. And neither do people in certain ways. What happens is that these three factors, which are borrowed from Sonia Livingston and Anna Leveroux's Handbook of New Media, are the key determinants of what happens with new media. And they're like cogs in a machine. And when one changes, other things move as well at the same time. So the artifacts and devices that we have in our hands, they change. They may change in the way that we use them to communicate and to convey information. At the same time, the practices in which people engage to share information also change. And the social arrangements that develop around those practices alter. And no one thing is leading, but everything is turning and changing at the same time. And I think we need to be aware of that. So there's a visual up there as well on the left. It's intended to signal the very optimistic, positive, you're at the center of this tremendously exciting technical universe. And on the right-hand side, there's something from school where children are engaging with this kind of culture outside and inside school, or attempting to inside school. Some of the things that are suggested by changes in artifacts include the fact that for some people who have access to these tools, the tools of media production, coding can be in your hands if you're fortunate enough to have this in the developed, affluent parts of the world. And the practices that you undertake with these devices, they are like producing and exhibiting. If you make things, if you remix things, if you collect content and display it to your friends and so forth, is kind of like curating the self for whatever purpose that is, including some of the riskier things that people do. And the social arrangements around that also change. And so there's an implication here for the co-location of pedagogy, and what we've called with Julian McDougall and I, who's a professor at Bournemouth University, and I've written a paper about porous expertise, which is this concept of being aware of the things that happen outside of school that might indicate useful skills and dispositions for inside school activity. A stereotypical vision of school and not school is really this slide. On the right-hand side, some commentators characterize school uses of technology as very closed, quite dull activity. This is a drawing from a child in a primary school who's chosen to depict school version of technology use as the backs of chairs. Can you see that? It's a network room, a computer network room on the right-hand side. The most exciting thing in the computer network room is the wheels on the chairs, because you can, do this. So, and outside school, everything is in some commentators' eyes, evangelists would say, outside of school, children, young people are doing such cool and amazing things. And so inside school, not good. Outside of school, great. Actually, the truth is more complicated, as I'm sure you realize. And that is that things of value pass between the two quite regularly through something that I've just written there is, to me, it's a semi-permeable membrane and not necessarily a barrier. So from home, there's certain skills and dispositions you might get from using social media, and this, if you have access to these kinds of things, which could be built on inside school, inside the curriculum, to generate agency and so forth. Likewise, there are criticalities, critical distance, and other things that can come from inside school and travel in the other direction to provide safety, for example, and critical distance, and the opportunities to evaluate home uses of computing and technology as well. It doesn't need to be this barrier. And increasingly, I'm interested in something called the third space, which is this informal, quasi-informal space for learning, and the emergence in London recently and elsewhere in the UK of after-school clubs who are engaging in all kinds of digital making around animation, film, and coding, and all sorts of other activities in which children are agentive and making and doing things. And what happens with that is you get some children in movement between the two spaces, so their cultural practices, values, and affiliations are explored in the third space, but they might get some kind of critical distance about how to manage these things. And in the school space, you might see some change in the children who are exploring things in the third space. So there's a wonderful club that's run in Hackney, called the Hackney Pirates, which is run by a former master's student of ours and her colleagues. And it's a space in which children are encouraged to have a decompression chamber from school before they arrive home. They have some support for homework and so forth from volunteers. And in the second hour of the time that they spend in the Hackney Pirates, they engage in all manner of creative production, which is co-negotiated with them, and they provide guides for the neighborhood and do all sorts of things which sadly, to me, have been squeezed out of the curriculum as it's got narrower and narrower and narrower in our country. These are drawings made by children in a project which I want to talk to you about, which was called Learners and Technology 7 to 11. These drawings were made in classrooms in 2008, 2009, around that time, and written up in a book with Neil Selwyn and Sue Cranmer called Primary Schools and ICT. The funding for this project came from an agency which the present government closed when they came into power, but was a source of funding for education researchers, which was called Bector. And some of you might have heard of the work of Bector. Every now and then they used to release funds which allowed for short-term, smaller-scale pieces of research to emerge of quite enormous value. I am, anyway, a big fan of the qualitative branch of research, the ethnographic and case study form of research, where you go into a situation and a setting and you explore it deeply, and you don't just use your research subjects as data gathering informants. Quantitative work has value, of course, and is well respected, but I'm primarily a qualitative researcher. So the funding was given to us to explore what are the sorts of things that children aged 7 to 11 are doing outside school that might improve the learning with technology inside school? And we chose a kind of mixed methods approach to this, and we were very cognizant of using something which was called the learner voice as a tool for exploring this issue. So we conducted a survey, we ran focus groups, or more accurately, we trained children aged 10 and 11 to run focus groups with younger children using voice recorders. The children made drawings on the back of the survey describing what they felt about technology in school and home and how it could be changed and so forth. And we also gave video cameras to the schools involved to keep for afterwards, on condition that they provided us with video evidence which would be filmed by the children themselves, quite simple devices. So they'd talk to each other about this and then give it back. Some of these methods worked and some of them were unsuccessful, let's be honest. So the most successful research actually turned out to be this drawn evidence. And we were very, very lucky to get some fabulous drawings, which I will run through later. And I think we were indebted in the use of drawings to the work of Di Mavers, who was a colleague of mine, who did such tremendous work with children's drawings in a project called Impact 2 several years ago, and did some very interesting analysis based on looking at the salience of various features of the drawings, building on reading images and multimodality theory. But at the outset, a child who was aged, I think she was 8 at the time, casts doubt on the whole enterprise. So she is asked by another child, "Do you think this research has any use whatsoever?" And she gives a very straight answer.
How could we use the experience of ICT at school more like what we are doing with ICT at home? So the things we do at home with like computers, could we use that at school?
No. Okay.
No. So it wasn't any use. Which is a finding, isn't it? It's a finding. Children don't think it's going to be any use whatsoever. It tells you something about the way that the children themselves perceive. I mean, we could be dishonest and never show this clip and say everything was fine. And we did get some very interesting findings. But to Neil and myself and Sue, these findings were important, where children actually said, "No, what do you mean? Of course there's going to be a difference. So it's going to be pointless to... the way that children live their lives in school is different to the way they live their lives at home. It's no use whatsoever." But digging a little deeper into that, it's interesting to look back at the drawings and to see some of the ways in which the drawings express a kind of real multiplicity of views and values which are held, which are not too dissimilar from the way that all of us feel at some point or another. And some of the findings, again, were kind of obvious ones, and some of them were not so obvious, especially to the kind of commentators who are very evangelical about technology in teaching and learning. So some of them, the children made drawings in which they asked for permission to change the way that rules are made in school. These children are aged, remember, between 7 and 11. You know, please let us go on YouTube, let's go on any websites we like to play more games. And in some of the schools that we were investigating, sometimes computers were used as a reward system. Maybe you're familiar with this approach. If you finish your real work, you can do some work on the computer. So there's this kind of desperate notion that that's a kind of good way to operate with technology. You know, if you finish this, you can do that. And of course, that only lasts for 5 minutes, and someone else then has to have a turn and so forth. So there was this sense in which there was a lid being kept on this very, very agentive need. And we interpreted it as being about children wanting to be considered partners in trust. One of the recommendations from this project was that could there be a way in which schools could negotiate circles of trust and democratic processes around the uses of teaching and learning. And partly because our research methodology was informed by the work of Professor Michael Fielding at the Institute of Education, who has we kind of built a democratic and emancipatory version of research at the third stage of his kind of four-stage model of the first stage being the lowest, which is children are just used as a data set. The second is you talk to them a bit. The third was you involve them in the conversation. The fourth level, which we never got to, was where the children themselves are used as co-designers of the research. It would be lovely to do a project like that at some stage. So we were hovering around this kind of third level of working with children. It won't surprise you that some of them also had a view that teaching and learning could be enhanced in the sense that eventually they wouldn't have to do anything. And this kind of utopian vision still persists in education and ICT in education, and ICT more widely, that we'll be free to do other things. So yes, the child is saying, and in the bit in the middle, the child says, do my work now or else. And there's a kind of robot happily typing away there. One of the things that we did uncover was that not every child thought that using technology anyway was a good thing. So where does this come from? When so many commentators are saying, hey, the curriculum could be enlivened by... If you talk to children, not all of them feel that way about technology. And some of them want to be in another space, away from the screen. It's an interesting and kind of quite controversial view. If you spend your life really promoting the use of ICT, you might think this is a rather dispiriting finding. Why are children like this? This child is like this because I think you can see there's something very wrong with his or her eyes. And we had another one where a child complained of headaches and neck ache and so forth. In these days, there were not so many, I see your colleagues here with iPads and so forth, not so many touch screens. And children were sitting, I guess, 2008-9, with screens that were quite high up in classrooms and network rooms, looking up on quite low seating and suffering all sorts of aches and pains. And I kind of getting into the world of being an office worker, I guess. They would be ideal in an uncomfortable office later in life. It would be something they'd be very familiar with. And then another strain emerged, which was, I guess this is a little bit off the wall. There weren't many like this. But this is some kind of crazy, imaginative idea about some of the things that you could make if you involve children as co-designers in activity. And this is, I guess, what gives me optimism about the new coding, creativity, computing curriculum. If it's done right, if there is some agency and it's not children chanting what an algorithm is every morning until they know what an algorithm is. If they're given the opportunity to make things in the same way as you might make a film or make animation, there might be cause for optimism here. So in this drawing, you can see there's all sorts of ideas for the future. This is an open mouth on the right-hand side, and in the back, there's a phone inside your teeth. So, if you're in a difficult situation, you can crunch down on your teeth and the phone's activated. You can ask for help. There's a camera in a fingernail. There's something that probably everyone in this room would love to play in, bottom left. A dome there, can you see? It's an anti-gravity dome. So, and the child is at pains to point out that it's not just a bouncy castle. This is a place where you could go and you stay floating. And the child has written at the side there, kids will love them. So you can imagine them going out to play and floating around in this anti-gravity. But there's a kind of engagement there with this, and it's being playful with it, but it's suggesting that there might be things that we could make and share and do. From some of the video evidence and using a kind of multimodal video transcription of the gesture in this clip, the boy who's just out of frame at the moment is speaking to 3 classmates and is saying, what do you do, outside of school that's connected to work? with your computer. So I'll play a little bit of this.
I mostly play like math things, like what you can do, find things and stuff.
Well, I don't know, I go on things.
So that boy is saying, I mostly play maths games and finding things out and so forth. And the other boy is saying, well, I don't do that.
Like MySpace, MSN, Pixel, things like that.
I play games and do research. I go like the science things and play games.
What science sites do you go on?
Primary resource like that. I mostly play that.
He's actually a very, very good interviewer, better than I am actually, and he elicits some very nice responses from the children about. But when I watched this video clip back lots of times, I'm thinking that the height of the video angle of the camera suggests that maybe this wasn't a child-initiated activity, unlike the other one. I think that it's possible an adult's filming this. And so most of the children there are on message. I do science, I do maths. This boy is not on message. The one on the right-hand side here, over here, him. And what he's keen to show is that he knows ways around, this situation and is not going to seek permission to do things that are slightly off limits. And Pixo is off limits. So notice the way he covers his mouth when he says, I go on Pixo here. So if you look at if you think multimodally about this, there's the mode of speech, there's the mode of gesture, and actually, ironically, there's the mode of framing which is coming from the adult, but the child subverses it, is subversive with it here. I go on Pixo, keen to show that he knows ways around the various blocking and filtering and so forth, and that there's a life behind some of this that is brought to life again in the conversation in the school setting. So there's just a quick run through some of the various findings, but it bears out the assertion that the social arrangements and practices and artifacts are changing, and so the world of pedagogy is changing as well, or could change. It could change for the better, it could change for the worse, but I think if we try to think about pedagogy as being something that exists as this movement, children move seamlessly between the different settings. They're the same child, but they have different experiences and different ways of constructing those spaces. And it would really be worth asking these questions. And so when I've done this talk or similar talk to students who've been wanting to have ideas for projects in classrooms, I've suggested, why don't you ask children what they think? Oh, it's not really rocket science to get children to draw and to make videos and to talk to them about some of the things that they have. And then you can look for frames that you can put around these things and try and gauge where they are in terms of their own agency and their own identity building and so forth. In my doctoral study, I was working much, at the beginning, very much more in the media world. I was looking for ways to describe children's informal media production, specifically with digital video. And I was looking for evidence that they had, innate, having consumed so much video over the years, that they had a kind of innate ability to construct video texts. And I didn't really pay enough attention at the beginning to such other things as dispositions and motivation and identity, but that's really where I ended up. And that's what led to eventually to that book, which was really about how the ways in which media operates, or media production operates now, with you are able to, if you have access to the various bits and pieces of technology, make things or collect things and display things, that this is like being a curator of the self when you exhibit it. It's not editing, it's not writing, it's not assembling, it's not exhibiting. It's a new literacy and cultural practice which embraces all of these things in one. And I think it's important to state that. I've talked about this a lot, and sometimes people misunderstand that curating as just being a collector, but it's not. Curating is about knowing how things work when they're placed alongside one another, and how the objects and artifacts speak to each other, how a clip that you've collected or a piece of music that you like says something about your transient affiliation at that point, and you choose to place it next to something that's more anchored of yourself. And what are you saying about that? And who are you showing it to? And to me, this is about managing identity, and the way I conceive of that as a metaphorical explanation for that is it is like you are being a curator of the self. I guess it follows from Jerome Bruner and other people, that idea that Jerome Bruner had that concept of every time you tell the story of the self, you make the self. So in the school in question, I'll just turn the sound off on this video and just play the video clip. They were making memory boxes of their time at primary school. So this is in the top of a primary school. They were collecting artifacts, putting them in a memory box to take away with them. In this particular part of London, it's the case that the children would be going to different secondary schools. It's not a small, London is a small country really, not a small town, and it's in this country called London, there are many different kinds of schooling and many different authorities, and there are even more now, all sorts of strange things springing up in our country. Some of them we know about, some of them who knows what they do. But 28 children in this class going to 12 different kinds of secondary school, and friendships potentially being broken and people not seeing each other again. So quite an emotional time in many ways. And so they had license with the camera to go and make productions which were about themselves, but also about their friends, their own affiliations and their own choices and their own predilections and tastes. And in other words, they were given an opportunity to curate the self. And in this, they had this very simple video editing software, but most video editing software is actually pretty simple. Even the hard ones are simple. They allow you to collect clips, to chop them up, to fade them from one to the other, but also to layer in sound and so forth. And Andrew Byrne and David Parker, in analyzing media text, describe this interface as a multimodal mixing desk. So what's being mixed together in the multimodal mixing desk, and this is a transcription of a very short sequence, is the gestures that they want to suggest, the framing that they want to make around the video of themselves, and the sorts of things that they want to show that they did at this school, in this place. And so there are very, very many examples across the 10 different films that were made. Again, I'll run this silently for a minute, but here's just a collection of 4 of the 10 videos that were made. You can see the sorts of things that were going on with celebration of friendship, of games, places that they used to play, things that they used to do, a whole assimilation of memories. But each one had a different kind of ethos to it. This one on the bottom left is a kind of, at least in this section, was a very formal documentary set of interviews of the head teacher and the school keeper, and the children here wanted to investigate what the adults thought about a variety of topics. These particular ones down here, you can see them in a multi-sensory area down the bottom here, special needs area. There's a sense in which having a camera and being near the end of your time at primary school gives you license to do all sorts of things that you wouldn't normally do. So this one here is, you can see they're just throwing these balls at each other basically and celebrating just being allowed to do that. Here, the children concerned, the 2 children were both girls in the school, and they celebrate...
Sylvia Thompson, who was an old secretary of the school.
Talking to each other quietly about the spaces that they used to be in.
We always used to sit on this bench when we were sad or happy, and we always felt better after a while. This is one of our favourite bits because Well, whenever I was upset, Artie used to take me to this bench and cheer me up always. And although this area is quite new, but we had lots of good times and bad times. It's also very good. It's nice and shady.
They talk about all the good times and the bad times that they had. And there's an emphasis in this on a very kind of to-camera heartfelt kind of documentary style celebration of the friendship of these two individuals in all of the spaces that they used to be in, which contrasted with this one where the two boys concerned make a video where they okay. How to explain this? Well, they're playing the harmonica, and their identity markers here are that they like this kind of music. And again, if you do a video transcription using a multimodal frame, you look at the way that they're standing with each other, how the shot has been constructed, the gestures that they make, this two-shot, echoing these two penguin creatures here. They're actually performing a song that they did in front of the whole school when they were in year 4, aged 9, which was a kind of parody from The Simpsons of Marge Simpson removes Bart Simpson's batteries from his Game Boy, and he sings a blues song about how sad he feels about this. They sang that to the school in year 4, and they painted the mural behind there in year 2, and they're in a video which they're making in year 6. So they're referencing something like 4 or 5 years of experience in an 8-second segment from a 3-minute movie. So there's a sense here in which, yes, I could write, and I did write, about the opportunities that are being lost if we don't allow children to make some of these other literary forms, such as video, because who knew that they could do that? And there's also a sense in which that there's a tremendous amount of sophistication going on here. If we know a little bit more about the aesthetic and embodied responses of these students to their surroundings. So multimodality is very useful in looking at the more formal designed elements of the text, but we need some other kinds of theories as well. And we need to look a little bit into theory of identity and identity construction. And some of these authorities would be people that we would necessarily consult, such as Goffman and Giddens and Bauman and so forth. But also something about Bourdieu, and that children's learned ways of being in a space can be expressed quite nicely in a multimedia video production, and can be questioned and critiqued and so forth. But we need to be careful that we're not going into a kind of new autonomous literacy here by suggesting that devices by themselves free children to do all of the things that we'd like them to do and so forth. It doesn't quite work that way. And we need to have frames around which we throw these kinds of activities. And one of them, suggested by this work, is this idea, I think, that children can be considered to be curators if they have the opportunity to be curators of their own experience. So my thesis was originally concerned with the area more on the left about the forms and organizing principles in production, but moved over to the other side to embrace ideas about identity and representation and so forth. And I think that in thinking about the ways in which this may or may not happen in our schools, I've been lucky to go into various projects, and each one of these is a different kind of moving image project, which suggests that it's no longer tenable to think of literacy as only print literacy, which is not the same thing as saying that it has, that we need to only have multimedia version of literacy as well. I think that the extreme positions never really work, and that we should be co-located in the middle somewhere, which leads me actually to where the curriculum is in the moment, at this moment up to September next year. There's an opportunity for coding to be considered as another form of new literacy skill, where you put the children, you empower children to realize that they have the ability by issuing commands to something to make things happen. And actually the project on the screen there on the top haven't really begun to write about it yet, was something I observed in the summer with a colleague called Theo Breyer at the Institute, in another project. We were collecting data in a summer school third space creativity project, which was children making computer games from stories using the Scratch MIT interface. And there's so many things to say about this, more than there is time. But it occurred to me that by the end that I was not talking about computer science so much as a further version of digital literacy to sit alongside making animations and making videos and remixing music and so forth as could be part of a cultural experience and not a specialized, ascetic, withdrawn kind of form of endeavor that children would be bored by, but it should be something that they could make and do with each other. And it's 46 minutes and 47 seconds since I started speaking, so I should stop. But thank you for listening, and good luck with whatever it is you're doing out there. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Professor John Potter, for this very interesting presentation. And now, what about questions? Yes, please.
So I would like to question you, did you find gender differences in the use of media in children?
Yes, in a word. Yes, and it's one of those, I remember at the beginning I said that there are things that I'd like to go back to do, and I think I would like to go back and explore that. If you're talking about the doctoral study, definitely, and it's been pointed out before, but as many gender differences as there would be in filmmakers in this room making films as well. So not something specific to young people and gender difference, I think, but there were some really interesting differences in the way that the task of making a representation of yourself was made by the boys group, the girls group, and different again was a mixed gender group as well. So yes, definitely, and it would repay study actually. And I think a really useful form of research would be to go and look for that and look at that and talk about it.
And in programming, did you find different?
Yes, it's too early to say because it's still very, very new. But in my mind, I have I'm thinking about when the children were doing the summer school project. There was a group of two groups. There was a mixed group, went from one part of London to another part of London, and in the other part of London was all boys, except for one person, but dominated by boys who liked to program and liked to, open the laptop and disappear into this world of code. But one of the girls was very forthright about her experience of gaming and her position as a 13-year-old girl playing games, which was there are not enough women in the gaming industry, not enough role models, not enough, and it was all of that kind of conversation really sparked an interest from the boys, and it was very, very well managed by the teachers from the place that we were studying. And it was the third space out of school provided that kind of criticality I was talking about before. It was neither one thing nor another. The discussion was not limited, but it was certainly focused and enabled to have a kind of critical space, but also a playful interrogation of this situation. And some of the boys changed direction with what they were doing as a result. She also said, by the way, about violence in games, she was very eloquent about that. Of course I don't want to go and shoot people, it's a game, was one of the things that she said.
John, thank you very much for your presentation. I agree with many of the things that you were presenting here. I think that in the UK now you have a beautiful opportunity with this Raspberry Pi and all this coding initiative going back to school. I mean, what I think it's a very meaningful use of technology. But this is posing me a kind of open question. What is the role of the teacher? I mean, the teacher are really prepared for that because, I mean, of course the kids know how to do the videos, but what about the teachers? And I'm not meaning that they need to be expert, but they don't need to be at least afraid, because it's also happening, at least in our experience with games. There is a subversion of control when you allow the kids to bring their own devices into the school. Because now, or at least in Spain, the situation is that when kids enter into the school, they go back to the 19th century school, where there's no devices, and their expectation about technology is very, very, very far from reality. So or at least in Spain, the current use of technology is to have a smart board, that this will be used very basically. I mean, depending on which are the competencies from the teachers, but in my experience, teacher has not been trained into how to use that efficiently. They feel aggressed by technology. So they have the impression that society and everyone is expecting them to do plenty of things for what they have not been trained, they have been not properly educated. So I think there is a kind of reluctance to actually use technology in school. And I really feel it was the same in Spain. Sometimes they are using technology as a reward, not as a useful technology, or as a useful help. So I mean, if you behave well, then you go to the computer room, or you are allowed to use these devices. So it's, I mean, this aspect of technology acceptance in relation with the teacher. I mean, as you have a lot of experience in that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's very different. It is difficult to be a teacher anyway, but it is very difficult to be a teacher in a performative environment. And in the UK, we have a very dim view of teachers in our press, which is dominated by a commentary that they're essentially kind of useless, and it's to do with something to do with the erosion of the state sector, blah, blah, getting quite political about it. But so it is quite difficult to innovate in a performative environment where your position in the league tables is to look at it from the teacher's point of view. They need to maintain the position of their school, they need to maintain the confidence of their parents, and that makes it means that the locus of control is further from them, and the only way to bring the locus of control back is to move back to what they feel comfortable with. So it is a difficult situation when coding, computing, programming, app building is going to make a deep impression in the UK curriculum, and there aren't that many teachers around who can actually do it. I think it's going to be a very difficult situation to manage, but it might be that this is where the third space becomes a very important space. City learning centres, after-school clubs, places where children can go and get some kind of confidence, where teachers can maybe link up with and get some kind of confidence in that area. So inevitably what will happen is that the schools that are open to that and the teachers that are open to letting go, the more confident teachers will get better at it. And in some schools the experience will not be so good. But you're right, I mean the role of the teacher anyway in this is different to the earlier versions of pedagogy, and it's much more to do with criticality and to do with providing safe spaces, to be social agents of change and that kind of thing, more than a fount of all knowledge, a pedagogue, a dictator, a kind of, content provider. And that too is difficult to manage when you're judged by your results. Other education systems will probably, do it very differently. And they have a higher respect for teachers anyway. It's a master's profession in many countries. I look forward to the day when that comes back into our own experience of it. But it's a very good point you've made.
Any more questions? No? Well, because we exceed a bit time, we'll continue on at coffee. But before, we have some announcements.
Thanks. Thank you.